War has been a staple part of human history for as long as anyone could remember. Tribes have been waging war against one another since the very beginning of time for things like resources and land. A notable aspect of the wars that have been waged throughout history would be the number of lives lost by each side. Losses that could be gigantic or meager at best. We, as humans, have a tendency to see certain things as being irrelevant in our everyday lives. Often, we see them as being irrelevant due to the simple truth that we believe that they will not be useful or play any important role in the future. More often than not, those certain things often become forgotten, forever confined into the pages of a book, or lost memories in someone's mind, gone in a split second like a gust of wind. However, certain events have happened and they hold significant importance, except they are just not relevant to those who see the events in recorded history as being applicable to their own lives. The saying goes, those who not learn history are doomed to repeat it. The sacrifices of the soldiers and the roughness of war are no exception to this. So to ensure that they are not forgotten, memorials have been created in their memory. Memorials that are kept around to ensure that they will not be forgotten or condemned to be just a couple facts in a school history book. Placed on the northeast corner of 2nd and Spring Garden Street is the World War I Doughboy Memorial. The Doughboys World War I Memorial is a prime example of what I just talked about a second ago. The statue is of an American soldier, or doughboy, as they were often referred to as, raising his fist up in the air and leaning his body forward as if to lead a charge into enemy trenches, which was often the case during that time period, where there weren't many other methods which could be used to take over the enemy's position. Often battles would end in a stalemate, since there was very little room for mobility. At certain times during the war, where progress must be made, the High Command would often order their soldiers to a suicidal frontal charge. These charges would inevitably lead to high numbers of casualties, as the defenders were almost always armed to the teeth. American and French High Command were no exception to ordering their soldiers to such actions. The plaque on the pedestal reads, "In memories of our boys of the 6th, 11th, and 12th wards who served in the nations, 1914 to 1918. The plaque is obviously stating that the memorial is dedicated to the American soldiers who fought in the Great War, otherwise known as the First World War, where over 1 million U.S. soldiers served to protect their country and family. Vietnam was a place that many soldiers from the First World dreaded going to in the 1960s, as at that time it was a hot zone for a major conflict. The conflict starting from November 1st, 1955 and ending in April 30th, 1975. American involvement wasn't formally allowed by Congress until April 7th, 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed. During that time span where the U.S. was involved in the war, as many as 304,000 U.S. soldiers were wounded in the fight, and returned with them were stories of their comrades who had suffered a much worse fate. In this conflict, 58,000 soldiers lost their lives, American soldiers more specifically. Dedicated to this tragedy is the Philadelphia Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The Philadelphia Vietnam Veterans Memorial, or PVVM for short, is a group of walls dedicated to the Americans serving in the Vietnam War. On the south wall of the memorial are a group of names, and all the other walls have info about the conflict in Nam itself, from start to finish. What this monument of war is known for is the Wall of Names, in which is the previously mentioned South Wall, which has the names of a couple hundred soldiers, more specifically to the sacrifices of 646 Philadelphia natives that served in the war during that time. This memorial is placed on Front Street between Spruce and Delany Street for all to see. Going back about a dozen years before the Vietnam War, the Korean War was raging on, the war between the communist regimes and democratic republics over the peninsula of Korea. A great deal of many soldiers died over the course of the war for all of the participants in it. Close to 5 million soldiers and civilians died during the war. However, the number of deaths for Americans was only a mere 36,574, as stated by the Pew Research Center. A small loss compared to the casualties suffered by their opposition. A small loss, but a loss nonetheless. To ensure that their sacrifices are not lost in memory, the memorial was dedicated to the Korean War on the 22nd of June in 2002. At the center of the memorial is a 16 feet tall black granite-clad pillar with the names of the casualties from the Philadelphia area. According to the Delaware Riverfront Company, the memorial was dedicated to the 610 soldiers killed in action that came specifically from Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and Philadelphia counties. Surrounding the pillars in the middle are 6 granite-clad monoliths with information about the Korean War inscribed into it. The design choices for this memorial was made by a contractor company by the name of JJ. An interesting memorial on water in Philadelphia would be the Uss Olympia. It's a memorial dedicated to the Spanish-American War, which lasted from April 1898 to August 1898. Currently, the ship is located at the Independence Seaport Museum in 211 South Christopher Columbus Boulevard, and it's been there since 1957. The USS Olympia itself is a cruiser. A cruiser is defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary to be a moderately large, armored and gunned warship. It was finished being built by a company called Union Iron Works in San Francisco, California, in the year 1892. Soon it was put into service for both the Spanish-American War and the First World War, until it was finally decommissioned in 1922. Well, what's so special about this floating hunk of metal, you might ask? Well, the historical significance of the USS Olympia is that it is the oldest floating steel warship to date, as well as being the sole surviving naval vessel of the Spanish-American War. Interestingly enough, the Independence Seaport Museum is also home to another naval vessel, known as the USS Bakunin, named after the Bakuna, which is a narrow Mediterranean fish. It was built by General Dynamics Electric Boat and was first launched in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War. The type of naval vessel that the USS Bakunin is that it is a Balao-class submarine. It was used from May 27, 1944 to November 7, 1969. During this time, she saw action in the Pacific Theater of War in the Second World War, where she was tasked with 5 patrol missions and had sunk 4 naval vessels in her time. Skipping a bit of the ship's history, her ownership was transferred from the U.S. Navy to the Cruiser Olympia Association in 1969, where she was turned into a museum ship for people to see. Another interesting thing is the Aero Memorial. The Aero Memorial could be simply described as a giant shiny sphere that is placed on top of a platform. The memorial was designed by Paul Manship, and it had been created in 1948 and installed in 1950. More specifically, the memorial is a bronze sphere on the top of a granite base. On the base it reads, Aero Memorial, World War I, 1917 to 1918. Clearly seen on the details of the sphere is its influence from old Roman and Greek art. Its purpose is to honor the aviators that had died during the First World War, as more often than not, being shot down often spelled out certain death for pilots. The reason being that parachutes were not issued, due to the belief at the time that it would encourage cowardly actions. According to John F. Ross, an American historian and author, American pilots never wore them because the higher-ups, who had never flown themselves before, believed that these devices would make a pilot more likely to jump out at the first hint of danger. Too many planes would be lost. End quote. This shows their preference for their pilots going down in glorious flames rather than jumping ship. Many more pilots had to go down in flames, and parachutes were not implemented until after the Great War had ended. This glistening piece of art is located at Aviators Park, between Benjamin Franklin Parkway and 20th Street. Going back in time, we have the Civil War, a war in which soldiers who were once neighbors fought against their fellow countrymen. Many men from the North lost their lives to the South as they went into combat against their Southern countrymen. Their great divide stemming from beliefs of what is right and wrong. In order to prevent the memories of these soldiers from being forgotten, an ark was created in their honor, proudly named the Smith Memorial Ark, after the person who initiated the project. The ark was created by various artists that include Charles Grafley, Alexander Strinkhalder, Daniel Chester French, Edward C. Potter, John Massey Rhine, and John Quincy Adams Ward. It was completed being constructed in 1912. The arch took a total of 15 years to complete, according to the Association for Public Art, and I quote, "The memorial is comprised of 9 busts, 3 figures, and 2 equestrians." End quote. The memorial had 2 figures standing atop of the arches, who are Major General George Gordon Meade and Major General John Fulton Reynolds, while the 2 figures standing on the equestrians below the previously mentioned generals are Major General John B. McClellan and Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, each of the generals being designed by various designers. The arch had the composition of bronze and limestone. It is located at the entrance of West Fairmount Park today. Located at 217 to 231 West Washington Square is the tomb of the unknown Revolutionary War soldier in the Washington Square. The tomb of the unknown soldier tells of the soldiers that have died to give liberty to the people of the United States. That is very true, as the Washington Square served as a final destination for many, serving as a mass burial ground for prisoners of the Wall Street jail, casualties from a yellow fever epidemic, deaths from Washington's army in the Revolutionary War, and even British soldiers. Burial started in Washington Square from 1706 to 1796. After quite a bit of time has passed, the Washington Square Planning Committee created the memorial to honor both George Washington and an unknown soldier from the Revolutionary War. Sometimes companies do extraordinary things to honor their workers for their dedication and hard work. Some companies give pay raises, and others just give their employees a pat on the back. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company went a bit further above expectations. Their tribute to their loyal workers was a giant statue. The statue was dedicated to its employees who had died in the Second World War. The statue is presumably of Archangel Michael raising a dead soldier from the battlefield. As it could clearly be seen, the artist has drawn his influence for the statue from religious mythology. The artist being Walter Kirkland Hancock. The statue itself is made of bronze, while the base it stands on top of is made of black granite. On the base, there is a plaque that reads, "In memory of the men and women of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who laid down their lives for our country, 1941 to 1945. The pedestal has the names of exactly 1,307 of its employees that had died in the Second World War. It was placed on 30th Street Station on 1952nd, and it has been standing there since then. While I cannot cover all the memorials within Philadelphia, a good chunk of them were given enough spotlight so that you would at least learn a thing or two about them. Not enough to become an expert on the memorials that were covered, but still enough to be at least knowledgeable on these monuments of war. Although learning about them is nice, I personally encourage you to visit one of these memorials in your spare time. Plus, a lot of these memorials are free to view anyways. It may not mean much to you, personally, but it is still there for people to remember the rough conditions and sacrifices of war. Also, if you don't have the time to spend visiting these memorials in person. Images of the previously mentioned memorials are always available on Google. Before I leave you to do as you please, there's a question I would like to ask you. The question is, if you could build a memorial, what would you dedicate it to? I would be interested to know depending on the answer you give me. The more interesting, the better.